Welcome to ACURA. I'm James Carden. On Thursday evening, Tucker Carlson released his much anticipated interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin. To discuss the interview, which many in the mainstream media are calling a propaganda win for Putin, I'm joined by two esteemed experts in Russian affairs. Matthew Dal Santo is an associate professor of church history and dogmatics at St. Patrick's Seminary and University in Menlo Park, California. Educated at the universities of Cambridge and Sydney, he is a former fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He has held visiting fellowships at the Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington and the Catholic University of America. He has also served as a foreign policy officer with the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. He is currently working on a theological reading of the Russian Revolution for Princeton University Press. Paul Grenier is an essayist and translator who writes frequently on political philosophy, urbanism, and foreign affairs. His essays have appeared in American Affairs, The National Interests, The American Conservative, among many others. He holds graduate degrees in international affairs and geography from Columbia and worked for many years as an interpreter for the U.S. Defense and State Departments, interpreting for General Tommy Franks and serving as a lead interpreter for U.S. Central Command's peacekeeping exercises with post-Soviet states. Paul and Matt are co-founders of the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy, which has launched a new Substack project titled Landmarks, a Journal of International Dialogue. And I hope that we can talk about that project in the coming discussion. But first, to the interview that's on everyone's minds, Tucker and Vladimir. The president of Russia began with kind of a soliloquy, a rather in-depth history lesson for Tucker, who the president noted was a history major in college. So what you're both, historians and experts on Russia, what to make of this history lesson in terms of both its accuracy, but what was really, do you think, the point behind it? So I'll start with Paul.
Great to be here with both of you, Matthew and James. And James, thanks for hosting us as well. And the interesting, I think that this whole discussion between Putin and Carlson, for reasons that we can get into later, I think forms a nice segue to the things that we've been doing and publishing on Landmarks recently, and which people can now read on Substack and not just on our website. But I think one thing that occurs to me, and we were kind of talking about this, James, earlier before we started, is that history lesson probably wasn't mainly meant for Americans. That wasn't, from Pushkin's perspective, that wasn't his most important audience, although Americans always think probably that everyone wants to appeal to them. But I think that there was a turning of the tables, that if you look at the internal conversations within Russia itself among intellectuals, they're very much aware of the fact that the West has been thinking of itself as being the teacher and Russia as the pupil for at least a century. That you guys are playing catch up, and you should look at us with open mouths and wait for what you're supposed to be and what modernity is supposed to look like. And I think that his simply monopolizing the conversation, it wasn't even a conversation, obviously, it was a monologue. I think he was subtly psychologically saying, we're not your student anymore. Listen to us. But as for the conversation, that the accuracy of it as a historical statement, I noticed that happened to read something from The Economist, which said that Putin just was spouting his usual lies in that history lesson, including in respect to World War II, because after all, it was the Soviet Union that collaborated with the Nazis, and not the West, and not Poland, as he implies when he made that comment about Czechoslovakia. But that's an extremely complicated period of history to disentangle. But I mean, if you go back to what was actually being said in the British Parliament in May 1939, there was Churchill was haranguing Chamberlain for not accepting Soviet Foreign Minister Litvinov's offer to form an alliance against the Nazis of England and France and the Soviet Union. Everyone knew that the Soviet Union that Hitler had expansionist plans and hated in particular the communists. So the last thing anyone expected was some sort of non-aggression treaty between Germany um, and the Soviet Union. But all summer long, Chamberlain was dragging his heels and slow walking any kind of agreement. And Churchill himself was saying, "Why are you doing this? We should make this agreement." And in fact, it is the case. And if you read William Shirer's history of the period, and he was in Germany at the time, and one of the greatest American journalists of the 20th century, fluent German speaker, he notes all of this the fact, including that when just as Poland, I mean, excuse me, before Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union had appealed to Poland saying, "Can we move our troops through your country and send our planes in order to help Czechoslovakia?" And Poland refused. So that may be what Putin was referring to. I'm not by any means trying to make excuses for Stalin's behavior or the Great Purges and all the many reasons why people in England and France and the US were leery about cooperating with the Soviet Union. But on that narrow point, to say simply that Putin is lying is not accurate.
Matthew, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I actually found it one of the most interesting parts of the entire interview. In fact, I think that opening soliloquy, which would have turned, I think, a lot of Western people off, served a really important purpose as to Putin's overall purpose with the interview. And I think anybody who spent any time in Russia or elsewhere in Eastern Europe will know the importance of history and will know the importance of people feeling still very much bound by the deeds and actions, particularly the glorious and honorable ones that history attributes to their forebears, to their ancestors. It's quite a different. I think it's quite a different way of looking at the world from the one that we increasingly entertain. This sort of ideological presentism that increasingly defines Western civilization. But I think the overall message and what was fascinating to me about that monologue was that Putin was saying, as Paul was saying, "I'm the teacher here, and if you want, not just you, but any Western person, any American, wants to dabble in this part of the world, then you have to know about it. You simply can't assume that your own historical experience is sufficient to act well and properly in this part of the world. In other words, history isn't reducible to the American experience of it. That there are other experiences of the world that enjoy a right to realize themselves, and that in fact one of the primary sources and reasons therefore of this war that has broken out is the failure of the West to think outside its own experience, in fact to transform its own experience into a kind of ideology, an ideology of Americanism whereby it's simply enough to act well in a place. It's simply enough to desire to replicate in that part of the world the American experience of history. Yeah, I think the fundamental purpose of that opening dialogue was to point out to people just how erroneous, just how short-sighted, just how obviously inadequate that kind of assumption is, and just how obviously it lies at the root of the tragedy unfolding in Eastern Europe right now.
in a way, he seemed to have been picking up on a theme that he touched upon rather famously just over 10 years ago in a op-ed for the New York Times. Now, it's hard to kind of imagine now, given all the criticism Carlson has gotten for interviewing Putin, but Putin was welcomed onto the op-ed page of the New York Times in September of
Right.
2013. And he says in part in the op-ed that it is dangerous for any country, including America, to see itself as exceptional, whatever its motivation. So that seems to be exactly kind of the reading that you picked up on, Matthew. The other thing that
It's not just exceptionality, though. It's not just that America happens to an exceptional degree to manifest truths also present in other people's histories and experiences of the world. It is that America's experience is the only one, and it's universal. Any other reading of history any other experience is faulty. In fact, it's propaganda to the extent that it doesn't conform or find itself coextensive to the American experience of history. And what is the American experience of history? Well, it's the maximization of liberty at the expense of any other principle. It's in fact emancipation from Europe. It's emancipation from the metaphysical from the metaphysical anchors in which European civilization developed for 1,000 years. It's emancipation from any kind of geographical limit. It's emancipation from any kind of technological constraint. It's a rationality it's an emancipation from history. It's emancipation ultimately from, if we look at trends in American society today, it's emancipation from any sense of biology, right? So the idea is that a people and individuals are realizing themselves properly in history to the extent that they adopt this American logic of emancipation from all things, from any kind of pre-existent order, whether historical, biological, metaphysical. And it's simply enough for a people to identify themselves with that to become America's proper wards in the world. Hence, when Ukrainians identify a path of development towards the West, they therefore become the rightful claimants on American power, on American foreign patronage.
Well, I think you should, if you weren't planning to do already, I think it would be great for you to point people who are listening to you right now to your article that came out in First Things. What issue was that?
That was August, September of last year, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of the philosophical implications of the choice between Russia and the West that Ukraine is forced to make is not just a pragmatic choice, but it's a sort of a choice of civilizational types that you're forced to make, even if for all the cynical realpolitik, there's still philosophical implications for which way you go. Even despite maybe what the leader's intentions are, it just seems to be like the historical fate that it does end up having philosophical implications in the end, and civilization.
Right. I mean, I'd probably go further and say that the philosophical considerations are the driving ones. Certainly from the point of view of Western foreign policy, which is incredibly ideologically determined. And that ideology has its roots in a number of philosophical decisions that I think have determined the Western development in the way it has. But one of the things that I actually found refreshing about the interview was precisely the way in which Putin was able to speak calmly, knowledgeably, in the manner of a teacher, without reducing the content of his of his public speech to a kind of some kind of memorable soundbite, or some sort of appeal to what's the word, kind of like what you might call a liberal or progressive dog whistle that everybody is supposed to
Dog whistle.
that's right, to hear it and fall into line with. It was actually refreshingly free from the kind of ideological suffocation that I think an increasing number of people experience anytime they switch on the television or read the mainstream newspapers in the Western world, where it's very clear what the party line is, and you're kind of constantly being bullied into maintaining it. And I think that also characterizes a large element of the public reaction to this interview, one that Tucker should have dared to speak to the man at all. Two, that he didn't try to corner him into, well, maybe he didn't succeed in cornering him into any kind of in any kind of gaffes or immoderate harangue or anything of that nature. But it remained actually a kind of a rational conversation. I mean, what struck me was its rationality, and by comparison, the absence of a corresponding rationality in much Western public discourse.
Can I pick up on that non-ideological theme, James?
Right.
Following up on what Matt just was saying. Because I think one thing that struck me was that even though he was obviously resentful in terms that were very reminiscent of Richard Sakwa's book, The Lost Peace, that I was just discussing the other day with Marlene Lockwell and Richard Sakwa. He went through the whole list of how the West didn't allow Russia to be integrated into the OSCE, or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or any other security system that would have given it a sense of its interests, its vital security interests being protected. It rejected, Clinton rejected the Putin's early idea that maybe Russia could even be integrated into NATO itself, as a means of achieving the same end. And over again, they're either rejected or deceived. Even so, he didn't launch into a us versus them worldview. When Tucker talked about multipolarity, rather than taking that idea and running with it and saying, yes, now we in China and India are going to be stronger and we're going to bury you in sort of Khrushchevian terms, he didn't say that at all. He said he took the metaphor of two hemispheres and it related it to the brain, and says that the unity of the world, just like the unity of the brain, is primary, and these differences happen within this prior unity. And that theme ran throughout his entire talk. There was always a sense of things being of wholes being prior to, and without negating the West being its own particularity, or Russia being its own particularity, or other nations. So that I think is it's a very Russian way of thinking in general that he was expressing. And of course, the most memorable phrase, I think, came at the end, where he says that despite the fact that it's going to probably take many, many years for the wounds of this war to heal, that ultimately Russia and Ukraine are part of one people, and the soul, and the faith that we share is what makes us a unity above and beyond this tragedy. So again, you have that same theme of.
Yes, I was really struck by that too, Paul. I thought that it was a very bold claim to make, but one which I found quite moving when it was made. And it also, again, struck me simply that reference um, to the soul as the source of the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, a soul tended and cultivated by the Orthodox Church. I mean, it's obviously unimaginable to think of any Western leader speaking in similar terms, and this, I think, is to go partly back to the point I was trying to make in the essay of last year, and that is that there is a degree to which the Russian imagination, the Russian view of the world, Russian culture remains unsecularized, even when Russian society reproduces many of the symptoms of secularization in terms of low Sunday church attendance, etc., etc. Russian culture retains a sense of the sacred, a sense of a sense of the reality of the sacred, a sense of the fact that there exists to the world a dimension that isn't reducible to the material. Hence the soul, hence the reference to the soul, and why it can make sense in a Russian setting that doesn't have any real analog in the West. We don't tend to talk. We don't talk about our souls as much. We talk about wanting to liberate our wills, and the will is fundamentally an individual thing. Of course, so is the soul, but it's something which, of course, the churches, under the influence of the church, is also a source of communion with other people in a way that I don't think the will is, right? At least not in the way we understand the will in our secularized Western culture. So I found that very striking. I found it a very bold claim, but I also found it, I must say, a reassuring one to hear the Russian president make, because I think one of the great misrepresentations of this whole war is that there is some eternal Russian hatred towards Ukrainian people as Ukrainian people, and that's a complete misunderstanding. It's in fact precisely because they love them so much, right? That they don't want them to.
Well,
they don't want them to go.
The other takeaway, since you mentioned that, that you're seeing a lot of in the media in the aftermath of the interview, was the part of the Putin history lesson with regard to Ukrainian
Right.
So I have a short paragraph that I'm going to read to you by Fred Kaplan, who is, for reasons unknown to me, a popular international affairs writer in the United States. He writes for Slate. And what he says is basically been written in other ways of the past 24 hours in other outlets. The upshot of Putin's lecture, it soon became clear, was that Ukraine never existed as a nation, a culture, or an ethnicity separate from Russia, that there was no mention of such a place until 1919, when the Bolsheviks created the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And therefore, the assertion of Ukrainian independence after the breakup of the USSR was an absurdity and a gesture of ingratitude. This, writes Kaplan, is total nonsense. So what did you guys make of Putin's take on the history of Ukrainian nationhood, and does Kaplan have it right, or does Kaplan
Well,
have
of course
it?
he doesn't. He has just as tendentious a reading of the historical material as Putin does to an extent. But I mean, if you read any English language history of Russia printed before 2014, you'll read in it statements very, very similar to the ones Putin made. It's not nonsense. It's kind of the classical reading of Russian history,
Kluchevsky,
whereby
I mean, the history book that we read in American colleges by Kluchevsky would have said
right,
exactly the same thing.
exactly. And this then, I mean, if you read, for example, you know, the great British historian of Russia, Geoffrey Hosking, his Russia and the Russians. It follows very much the same path. You know, you begin in Kiev, you then go to Moscow. Moscow gathers the Russian lands, as it were, the problem of Ukraine arises precisely because these peoples, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, are on one level one people, and on another level distinct regional variations of that one people, right? And so there is in Kaplan's reading of history an inability to comprehend the possibility of plurality within unity, which is you know, a typical pathology of the modern Western mind that can't cope with metaphysics. But it's not beyond the experience of most peoples. I mean, is there such a thing as Bavaria as relative to Germany, right? The relationship between Ukraine and Russia is, you know, bears many analogies to that between Bavaria and Germany before the 19th century. And people, you know, responsible historians, like, for example, I'm thinking now of Dominic Lieven, again, another great British historian of Russia, have made similar points. It is not at all clear, and most Western scholars bend over backwards to try to deny any kind of essentialist reading of national identity, and unless and until it served their political purposes to do so, right? So any Western scholar would want to point to a form of ethnogenesis, a creation of national identity, where any number of options were on the table, right, at various points in history. And to say that there has always, therefore, been a Ukrainian ethnos that is somehow biologically different from a Russian one, is to fall back into the kind of essentialist thinking that most Western historians most of the time want to escape. Only, I think, in this occasion, it serves
It's
their
also the
purpose.
case that there hasn't, prior to 1991, when was the last time there was a Ukrainian state? I
Right.
mean, let's Kiev and Rus, prior to the Mongol invasion.
Right, and they didn't designate themselves as Ukrainians. They
No,
designated themselves precisely as Rus, right?
right.
Or you go back to the hetmanate of the Cossack hetmanate of the 17th century. But again, they didn't designate themselves as Ukrainians as such. They might have lived Ukraina in the borderlands, and that this notion of a Kraina recurs again and again anywhere in Eastern Europe where you have Slavic populations. The Krajina exists between the Croats and the Serbs too, right? This border space in which,
The word krai means edge. That's
well,
the root.
exactly, right.
So that's, I'm sure that's it. We're probably going to get on the Miratorics list for
Right, I'm
having
sure we
said
will.
that,
Right.
but the hit list, but it's nonetheless etymologically the case.
Right. And I think too, the religious element, I mean, there's an important church historical element to all of this, which modern Western historians fail to attribute proper significance to because they don't really understand religion. But if you read, for example, the history of Russian theology presented by, you know, a great Russian church historians such as George Florovsky, who taught at Harvard in the 1960s and 70s, I mean, Putin could have added footnotes to any of his works, you know, the ways of Russian theology, as sources for what he was saying. Not that he wasn't, of course, putting his own particular tendentious spin on these things, but to dismiss it as complete nonsense rather than as one possible reading of the history, is a gross misrepresentation.
I want to jump in and see if we can figure out a way to link um, the discussion between Dr. Carlson and Putin with some of the stuff that we've been doing recently and publishing in landmarks for the Simone Weil Center.
Right.
And one way is like I think that one controversial point from a domestic Russian perspective among Russian political philosophers, not necessarily the public at large, would be where Putin, at least once, if not several times, emphasized that there's no need for a new Cold War, in effect, because the ideological reasons for it have disappeared. I wish I could have heard the Russian instead of just the translation, but in translation it came out that we're bourgeois now, meaning
Right.
that
That's right. I noticed that too. Yeah.
we're capitalists.
Yeah.
Like you. So why are we still being demonized
Right.
and not being allowed into the Western order? Since we're now part of the capitalist world as well, and the word bourgeois, of course, is pregnant with meaning in the Soviet context and in the Marxist context as well. And that suggests, if that's the case, though, you could turn that on its head. And in the way that at one point in his book, The Lost Peace, Richard Sakwa makes the point as a rhetorical question, not as a recommendation, but he says that by insisting on its own sovereignty, by Putin insisting on not being subordinate to the US-led liberal international order, it put itself in a very dangerous position.
Right.
One which, we still don't know how it's all going to shake out. It may end up having been a fatal mistake for Russia. Whereas if they had agreed to give up their sovereignty, and which Richard Sakwa is honest and fair-headed enough to realize was what they would need to do in order to get the West to leave it alone. They would have to become just like the Western Europeans towards the United States and surrender a great deal of their ideological and political sovereignty and subordinate their national ideas to the United States order and way of looking at things. But that would have come with benefits. I mean, there was a lot of money to be made by that, and you wouldn't be fighting this war right now. And so there's a real trade-off to be had, which then that raises the question, so what is it about being a sovereign Russian that is worth it? That's worth the cost, because America is very good at raising the cost of not allowing the United States to dominate you. And that almost seems to be the lesson. That in a sense, some people may call it cynical, but if you destroy a country like Libya, or name your country that's been destroyed, it's an object lesson of what you get if you cross the United States.
Right.
And
I wonder though, I wonder if the U.S. response, the U.S. Western response to Putin's invasion two years ago, I wonder if that holds anymore with regard to the costs, because it seems like the costs being bared now are primarily by the West. So in other words, the effort to sanction Russia has backfired. Clearly, the Russian economy, from people I've spoken to who live there, say it's in quite robust shape. So I wonder if, I don't think we're going to learn any lessons from that, but I wonder.
50,000 dead Russians at minimum.
Yeah.
That's quite a huge cost.
But, perhaps 10 times that on the side that the West is supporting, right?
Right. But that's assuming that the West cares about that, which is a fraud.
A questionable assumption. A lot of this points to maybe there's certainly a culture war element that's been going on long before the war began 2 years ago, right?
In Russia?
No, the reason that I think American elites politicians and writers like Kaplan find Putin to be so beyond the pale is this idea that they represent a different civilizational, indeed a conservative civilizational pole. And so we've been in a way, from my way of looking at things, waging a kind of Cold War, culture war against Putin's Russia for at least a decade. And that is something that I think we've all touched upon in the writings on landmarks. Do you see that, or?
Oh, absolutely. But I think that what we've been focusing on for the past half year in landmarks has been more the Russia's own sort of intellectual thought leaders' response to that whole question that Putin raises, is that are we ideologically part of the West, but we're just insisting on our own sovereignty just because, you know, for because that's just what we happen to, countries like to be sovereign just like that, regardless of the cost, or on for the sake of what idea. And you know, what is it about being Russian that's worth it is part of an internal conversation that's really fascinating and interesting within Russia, because it raises the question, not only is should Russia be separate from the West, but which West is it that it should be separate from? And so it's not, so there's people endlessly demonize Dugin, and maybe sometimes, and he does say sometimes things, particularly since his daughter was killed, understandably have sort of made him a bit more extreme than I think he was before. Where he's, you know, we're absolutely different from the liberal West, is completely demonized now in his rhetoric. But if you look at you know, someone like who was it, Garbuzov, who was the head of the USA Canada Institute of the Academy of Science, a very prominent Russian intellectual. And in the piece that we translated in Landmarks, he basically said he takes the opposite conclusion from what Putin does about sovereignty. He acknowledges, he says, the United States is great. The United States is rich. It's popular. Most of the world respects the United States. What are we doing fighting against the United States for? And he basically, in the middle of a war, he says that the Russian idea is a bunch of nonsense. It's just myths. There's nothing here to respect. We should be. He basically says, let's join the United States. They're great and they're wealthy. He was not surprisingly fired soon after publishing this essay. But this was the head of a major institute at the USA Canada Institute of the Russian Academy of Science in Moscow. So he writes that, in a sense, that opens the floodgates to a whole discussion inside Russia over responding to that. And with Boris Mezhuyev writing an article which appeared in a major Russian foreign policy journal, saying that we have to be sovereign from the West. We're separate from the United. In fact, we're sort of an island of our own, and yet ideologically we are still part of the world created by Western modernity and Kant, in the sense that freedom is still the highest value. And so, to that extent, we need to be conservative, maintain the value of religion, the value of our sense of the family as being headed by a father, and all these sorts of traditional values, the conservative values, but within the framework of the liberal enlightenment, in the sense of the prioritization of freedom. This is what Boris Mezhuyev is saying, and in response to that, there's a whole series of articles, starting with Victor Taki, that we published in Landmarks, where he says, if you're buying that aspect, he's responding to Mezhuyev, saying, if you buy that idea of what modernity is and say we must accept it, then we've already lost. We've already joined the West. We've already accepted the principle, which is going to undermine any sense of who we are. But But in order to return to who we are as Russians, he doesn't say we need to reject all of the West tradition. We need to instead see how the world that was initiated by the Scottish Enlightenment in Mandeville, which overturned the traditional sense of virtue by saying that egotism and greed encourages economic growth, and therefore egotism and greed are good. So therefore, you throw out the whole order from Plato to Thomas Aquinas, where virtue means that you're not you reject greed and you have a sense of self-discipline and self-limitation. We need to accept the West of Aquinas and Plato and the Church Fathers, but reject the world initiated by the Scottish Enlightenment. And then the following two essays, and I'll just be very brief. The one we could go into if we had time in more detail by Rustem Vakitov. He says yes to what Victor Taki says about preserving the values, the cultural, the philosophical values of the West, but we need to do so within a left-wing political order, which rejects capitalism as being damaging to make capitalism itself relativizes everything by making everything something that can be bought and sold, and therefore everything becomes a matter of commodity exchange and equivalent. We need to remember what was valuable from the Soviet experience, which managed to preserve high culture precisely because it wasn't capitalist. And then finally, there's another article that we published by Yuri Pushayev. All of this, of course, in translation, and which I translated, by the way, and where he basically accepts the West in the Edmund Burke de Maistre vein, but says we need to be aware that that's not what people are really, that's not popular, so we need to do so in a kind of a furtive way to defend that kind of full-blooded conservatism. So I think what's interesting here is that there's a very substantive philosophical conversation going on among Russian intellectuals that the Simone Weil Center, from the time of its founding till today, has been trying to engage. And that very engagement has been demonized from 2016 on.
Right.
Whereas we
And
could
that
have
this,
been talking about all of this and coming to some sort of actual mature civilizational agreement between adults. But instead of doing that, everything gets put on Russian bed of this ideological world, precisely as Matthew described it, that you either look at the way things we describe it, and if it's outside of that way that we describe it in the politically correct circles of the United States, then it's simply it's far right, or it's Putin's talking points, as Pelosi would put it, or some others, non-argument, some palatial kind of question begging kind of dismissal.
right. And I think the other important thing about these articles on landmarks and the window they provide on the conversation that Paul just described is that they provide people outside of Russia with a view of Russia that is far more complex than the one provided by most mainstream media, which if you were to follow, you would imagine Russia as being some sort of society dominated either by the kind of the oppressive propaganda of Putin, the dictator, where over against an embattled liberal intelligentsia that has in fact seen the light and would lead their country to it if only they were able to, with the help of the West, overcome the apparatus of dictatorship that Putin has arbitrarily imposed on the country. And on the contrary, what these essays reveal is the extent to which that intelligentsia itself is capable of producing philosophically searching arguments for many of the policies that Putin has pursued, and that the justifications, philosophically speaking, can often be found in philosophers who belong properly to the Western tradition. So that there isn't some sort of profound, this is not merely on the one hand a kind of irrational obscurantism or traditionalism devoid of any kind of rationality, but a philosophical discourse that represents paths that the West might have chosen but didn't, right? And those paths provide possible points of contact with the West, depending on what choices Russia wishes to make. But in raising the philosophical dimension to the question of great power status, well, why is it that a country might seek great power status? Why might a country seek to be the guardian of its own sovereignty, to enjoy real sovereignty in the world? Well, the typical Western response, the typical response inside either Washington or Brussels, is that the only reason a country might do that is for the gratification, for the enrichment of the person ruling it, to the extent that they don't belong to the West, right? And that is such a reductionist and such a simplistic view of international relations and view of the relationship between power and culture and civilization, that we do ourselves an extreme disservice by repeating it, and by really making it a kind of an axiom, both of our foreign policy and of our media's representation of the world. So I would really commend these articles to anybody interested in going beyond the caricature of Russian politics and of Russian intellectual life that is represented in most Western, especially English language reporting on Russia.
I think that's right. And I think that that's probably a good place to close the discussion for today. So I want to thank you both for joining us. And so thanks a lot.
I thank you very much, James.
Thank you, James. I guess I'll stop recording now.